Okay, we're at the second video of Getting Together, and here what we're going to look at will be dating, the processes, if you will, and what is expected, not in terms of what you might think. And we're also going to look at some of the historical kind of a bit of perspective about relationships, and then consider some of the other elements regarding how else do we get together before we have marriages. And we'll finish off with all of that, and then we'll be finished this particular chapter, okay? When we think about dating, we think this has been around forever, but it's actually a relatively new custom, and we call it dating. When we think about dating, it allows individuals to go out alone together without the intention to marry. Dating serves four basic functions. Now, you may not have thought about it this way, but there's functions, that is, it serves a purpose. One is about identity. It's an important activity in youth in terms of self-exploration and identity formation. That is to say, when you start to figure out who you are, when you're able to be with somebody where you can share information, be out on your own, and there's no intention about marrying, but you explore your sense of who you are with this other person, and you start to learn about who you are, about being able to answer the question, who am I? Secondly, it's intimacy. This is where the pursuit of committed, exclusive relationships that foster disclosure, emotional intimacy, interdependence, emotional attachment. What's important in terms of this intimacy is you start to dabble in, if not explore wholeheartedly, this issue of trust, loyalty, exclusivity and what that means and our ability to do that. And again, that links to identity. The fourth function is that of status. That dating is one way to enhance social status. You might remember a period of time in your life, in your youth, where you felt like you had grown up some when you started dating, and that is a status enhancement, if you will, social status. You saw something change in the looks of other people, or maybe you imagined that other people saw you differently because you were walking with somebody hand in hand. And then the fourth function is that of sex, the initiation into a sexual experience and fulfillment. This is where we start to dabble, and figure out what we are and what we do like and what we don't like, what we want and what we don't want, and exploring ourselves sexually as well as getting a sense about intimacy, status, and identity. Now, widespread access to and the popularity of internet has also affected dating. The internet drastically expanded the field of eligibility. As I mentioned in the last video, the field of eligibility is who is it that you're eligible to be partners with, and oftentimes it's geographically limited. But the internet has expanded that, where you're not limited to geography. Now, there are four main social forces that drive the rapid growth of online dating. A growing proportion of the population composed of singles. There's more people who are single. Increasing career and time pressures mean this group needs an efficient way of meeting intimate partners. Single people are more mobile, and the workplace romances are on the decline due to the growing sensitivity around sexual harassment. Same-sex dating may be difficult for high school and post-secondary students due to the prejudice and other pressures, even physical harassment. Because of social expectations and stigma, it's rarely acceptable outside the gay and lesbian society to bring a date to the same-sex social function. We've seen more examples of high school students trying, if you will, to break that sort of pattern, and we see more examples of support for that, but it's not something that we could say is universal. And often same-sex dating is postponed until adulthood as a result. Now, what you're seeing here is the 2011 census counted more unmarried people in Canada aged 15 and older than those legally married. Statistics reflect increase in divorce and especially the never married individuals. We're seeing that the population gets married much later than it used to, and as a result, there's more single people. Now, some of that is economically a problem because people are going to post-secondary, incurring debt, and finding it difficult to get starting a family when you're in debt. And some of that is women are also pursuing post-secondary and careers, which is postponing marriages as well. That in spite of these trends, our society believes in marriage, seen as a natural and necessary state of individuals are going to reach full development. Stigma occurs because singlehood is seen as chosen rather than involuntary. Unmarried women tend to have a higher level of education and professional success than their married sisters, and some choose not to marry for reasons such as religion. Now, when we consider sexuality, there's been changes over time. Historically, there have been 4 approaches to sexual relations among unmarried people. The first being the marital standard, the double standard, sex with affection, and sex for pleasure standards. When we look at marital standard, which would consider the first standard of sexuality in relationships, was sex in marriage is the only, and is only in marriage and only to produce children. Now that did have a secondary standard that emerged later than the first, which was called the double standard. Men have more sexual freedom. It's natural for men to go about and sow their wild oats. And if women did the same thing, they were called promiscuous. So it was considered a double standard that one gender, men, could go about and have multiple partners, but if women did, it was seen as negative and was stigmatized. In the 60s, in the 70s, there was sex with affection, where being able to enjoy a sexual partner who was really not intended to be a marriage partner, was really just somebody that you liked, you had affection for, but it wasn't love, but it was just more the exploration. And then sex for pleasure, where because of the birth control pill, it really impacted the development of this standard where having children became less the risk, and being able to explore sex and sexuality for this pleasure's sake became a possibility. Now, attitudes towards premarital sexual activity continued to become more permissive until the 1980s, and since then, it's stayed at about the same level. Proportion of teens who have had their sexual intercourse for at least once declined between 1996 and 2005. The proportion who reported becoming sexually active at the very early age also decreased. The younger we have sex, the higher the risk of unwanted pregnancy and sexually transmitted infection. It doesn't surprise us when we think of that, because we're not thinking in those kinds of terms at our younger years. Like women and men in general, lesbian and gay men tend to move into their relationships in different ways. Now, obstacles to love relationships, there's lots of them, but they have some common reasons for being obstacles. Many difficulties in intimate relationships relate to gender role socialization. That is, how we've been raised or how society expects men to be men and women to be women. It's difficult to deal with the relationship when the expectations of society may overrule or at least push us in directions that are different from what we would want to behave as. Men tend to use communication to achieve goals, establish authority, compete for attention and power, whereas women tend to use communication to build connections and solve problems. It's not surprising that men and women might have different experiences with one another when one is trying to solve a problem when the other is really just, is trying to achieve a goal. It's not surprising that men and women don't always understand one another. It's the ability of both to be able to effectively understand one another, listen carefully, ask questions, and gain better understanding. Same-sex couples tend to adopt a more equal communication in their relationship. The tendency between men and women, though, is that they both become more baffled and hurt by perceived lack of understanding of their partner. The same-sex couples, on the other hand, tend to establish a more equal communication. In both the same and opposite-sex couples, communication about feelings more often occur non-verbally than verbally, and misunderstandings are very common. If you can't be clear about your expression, it's not surprising misunderstandings are going to happen. But if we don't communicate very effectively and don't try to communicate more effectively to understand one another, we can expect misunderstandings to be more common and repeat themselves. Individuals come to new relationships with expectations based on the past. So if you live in the past and expect to see what has happened to you in the past happen to you with your new relationship, it's not surprising with the self-fulfilling prophecy that you're probably going to see it happen again. We learn from our family or through relationships with friends and lovers. Some expectations result in a warped communication and crippling relationships. An example is treating another as property, making the partner fit a fantasy ideal, deliberately misrepresenting oneself. These are all things that can interfere with relationships, and they are unfortunately not that uncommon. Quality of relationship during process of mate selection is important for marriage or cohabitation. Once communication patterns are established, they're difficult to change. So when we think about some of the problems that can go bad in a relationship, thorns in the relationship as you wear, love gone bad, unrequited passionate love or obsession with a loved person. Passion normally fades over time. That's not uncommon, with the result that some individuals believe that they have fallen out of love rather than entering a new relationship dimension. And this is part of the difficulty in terms of some relationships that move quickly and more rapidly. They haven't established strong intimacy. Remember the 2 developmental stages. The developmental task, develop a sense of intimacy, trust, disclosure, and build that relationship foundation. And if we don't do that very well, then when we peter out of the initial, passion of a relationship, then we don't see it as being another stage and exploring how will passion look different now compared to how it did when everything was brand new and first time. And so that's part of the communication breakdown, not about love gone bad necessarily, although in some cases that's exactly what's happened. When we think about the thorn in the relationship that sex has gone bad, sexual dissatisfaction may result from poor communication about sexual desires. And again, the emphasis is on communication. Infidelity ranges from flirting to kissing to sexual intercourse, often breaks trust, results in dissatisfaction, revenge, or jealousy, desire for variety, and sexual incompatibility. If you break it all down, it comes back down to communication. If you don't communicate about what you want and don't want, and you don't communicate about solutions, then it's not surprising that if the couple doesn't communicate effectively, that they will oftentimes look for solutions outside the relationship. It's because the communication has broken down inside the relationship. Dating violence takes on the same form as violence in a marriage. Date rape reported more often than marital rape, perhaps because sexual access is regarded as a right of spouse. In 1982, it became law that it was illegal for a husband to rape his wife. Only in 1982. It's remarkable. Sexual aggressiveness is more common among single men than single women. Related to acceptance of rape myth, especially belief that women, even when raped, enjoy sexual activity. And this became a huge issue in universities and colleges around Canada just about 10 years ago, and has continued, is that this rape culture has been carrying on as if this is something that is desirable. And it's a major mistake. Violence also occurs in lesbian gay relationships, similar in frequency and type to that between heterosexual partners. Now, when we see this sort of leading up to marriage, this getting together, there are some alternatives to marriage. And in Canada, the majority of couples will still marry. However, there's a growing number of alternative arrangements. Cohabitation is an example, living together without being married. Increasingly common at all ages, and living together may be a trial run for marriage for some people. For some couples, they see children as having a place in the relationship, even if they're not formally married. The predictions see that even more couples living together before or without marriage. Now, one alternative that's becoming more popular, surprisingly, is what's called LAT, L-A-T, living apart together. It's a relationship in which the partners don't live together. It represents about 8 to 9% of the Canadian population. The majority of them are under 30, and oftentimes this is temporary due to work. 45% are older than 30, and it's not always due to work, but oftentimes it is. Partners regard themselves as a couple, but other pressures and commitments keep them apart. Oftentimes it's short term. And then lastly, but it's worthwhile to consider, is difficulties in relationships has two main focal points. And I've emphasized them in this video. I'm going to repeat them here. Many difficulties in intimate relationships are related to gender socialization of both men and women, but especially when it comes to the differences in what's learned around communication cultures between men and women. And most notably, it's about communication and the developmental task, intimacy and foundation of a relationship. Communication about feelings more often occurs non-verbally than verbally, and that's where it causes a lot of trouble, is that non-verbally asks us to interpret what somebody else is expressing, and unless we talk about what we've interpreted, we don't get any confirmation that we've got it right. So we make assumptions about what each other is thinking and feeling. Individuals come to new relationships with expectations that are based on the past. The quality of the relationship, the developmental task, intimacy, and a relationship foundation during the process of mate selection and communication on which it is based are important for marriage that follows. Because what we do in our dating years with our partner and what we do in our marriage years are related. How you date is what you do when you're married. And so if it's not good when you're dating, it's not going to get better by getting married. So look, this is one of the values of dating, is get together and practice what it is that you want to see happen when you're married. Well, I hope this has been a helpful chapter on getting together. We'll get ready for our next one. Keep in mind to keep up with your work. Please don't let it slide. This is about time management. Good luck, everybody. Bye now.